All right, guys, welcome into Chapter 3, First Aid CPR. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the human body and some basic anatomy that you need to know to be successful as a first aid provider. Again, being familiar with basic body structure, where things are at, as well as basic function, kind of like physiology, helps a lot as far as when we're providing first aid. Knowing what might be going on, what care somebody may need, those types of things. Also, being able to use the proper medical terms allows you to be a better first aid provider as far as communicating with others when you need to. So when EMS arrives, if you're able to use the proper language, it's a lot easier to communicate what is happening with somebody, because that's what that language was created for. Okay, so we're going to talk about directional terms now. Make sure you understand what directional terms are and what they mean, because they're going to be on the quiz. So first and foremost, when we're talking about directional terms, we're talking about somebody that is in the anatomical position, which means that they are standing in this position with the palms of their hands out, their thumbs facing away from their body, and standing shoulder width apart, those types of things. Okay. So the first thing you have to understand with directional terms, when we're talking about the right and left, we're talking about the patient's right and the patient's left. Meaning that if I'm facing this person, I might think this is their right arm, this is their left arm. But in reality, when we're talking about anatomical terms and directional terms, we're talking about it from the person's perspective. So this is the patient's right arm, this is the patient's left arm. So if they broke their arm and they broke this arm, the patient broke their right arm. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about anterior and posterior. Posterior is referring to the rear of the body, so the back is on the posterior side of the body. Anterior is referring to the front, meaning the chest is on the anterior side of the trunk. Okay. Superior and inferior. Superior refers to closer to the head, whereas inferior refers to closer to the feet. So most of the time we're talking about something in relation to something else. So like the hand is superior to the feet, or the knee is inferior to the hip. But we can also talk about it on a specific body part, right? So when I'm talking about somebody's head, I may say on the superior side, the superior surface of somebody's nose, referring to the top of their nose, versus the inferior portion of the person's nose, maybe talking about the tip of their nose. Okay, so understanding those is really important. Next, talking about lateral and medial. If you go back to that last slide, you can kind of see that really well in the picture. Lateral is talking about further away from the middle, whereas medial is talking closer to the middle. So when I'm talking about, I'm just going to draw this to demonstrate. So for example, we got our cute little stick figure person here. Sorry, I'm not an artist, especially not on a computer. That's not even right, because we need to erase that. All right, so come on. So anatomical position, right? So medial would refer to this side of the person's arm, whereas lateral would refer to this side of the person's arm. Okay, your thumb is on the lateral side of your hand, your pinky is on the medial side of your hand, so on and so forth. When talking about proximal and distal only refer to extremities, okay, or limbs. So that means we're only talking about arms and legs, okay? Or your neck would count, right? Because we're talking about these things in relation to your trunk and where it attaches to your body. So, for example, if I'm talking about my arm and I have something wrong with my wrist, okay, I would say that the injury is on the proximal end of my forearm, okay? Or excuse me, distal end of my forearm. Proximal is closer to the body, where the body attaches. Distal is further away from where the body attaches to the limb, okay? So, for example, my wrist is distal to my elbow, but my elbow is proximal to my wrist. My shoulder is proximal to my elbow, whereas my elbow is distal to my shoulder, so on and so forth. If I have an injury down here closer to my knee on my thigh, I may say, or there's a fracture there or something, I may say the femur is fractured on the proximal end of the bone. Excuse me, distal end of the bone. See, they can be difficult and they can be easy to mix up, but that's what they mean. Okay. The last two we're going to talk about is superficial and deep. So superficial just means it's closer to or on top of the skin, whereas deep means it's further inside the body. So a common question that I ask as an athletic trainer, when somebody comes to me and they have pain right in the middle of their kneecap, I'm going to ask, well, does it feel like it's on top of your kneecap, or does it feel like it's deeper inside of your knee? And so when I'm describing that injury to a medical professional, I may say, well, they're describing knee deep deep to their patella, okay? Or I may say on the superficial surface of the kneecap of the patella, okay? Those are just some examples of those. Make sure you understand those for the quiz. All right. Come on, go back to normal. Okay, so the next part of directional terms is understanding the quadrants. So the quadrants are used when describing the trunk of the body. We divide the trunk into 4 different quadrants to identify where pain is and those types of things, okay? So the center point of the quadrants is your belly button or your umbilicus. It's the same thing, okay? And then when we're talking about the trunk, the biggest thing about understanding for first aid is knowing which organs are in which quadrants. So for example, your right upper quadrant, okay, so on the patient's right and on the superior side of the belly button, the umbilicus, there are very important organs like your liver and your small intestine. Most of that is found within the right upper quadrant. But the left upper quadrant has some really important organs too, like your spleen, okay? The right lower quadrant, the most important organ you're going to find there is your appendix. Well, I guess important is relative. The most commonly injured is your appendix. Your lower left quadrant, most of what you're going to find there is just intestines and or colon. So when it comes to pain in the abdomen, which we'll talk about later in the semester, we have an entire chapter on abdominal injuries. But knowing where the pain is at is really going to affect the way that I perceive an injury and the next steps that I'm going to take. Okay. So as far as the body goes, most life-threatening conditions are going to affect 3 different body systems: the respiratory system, or your lungs, your breathing system, your cardiovascular system, which is in charge of blood flow throughout your body, and your nervous system, which is in charge of movement and sensation throughout your body. Also, your nervous system regulates a lot of the automatic systems within your body. So those 3 become very important. Very important and organs that are essential for life, and when injured can really pose a big problem. So as first aid providers, we want to take a special care of the lungs, the heart, the brain, and the spinal cord. All right, so of those systems, the first system we're going to talk about is the respiratory system, in charge for breathing and making sure that your body tissues are getting oxygen. All of the cells in your body require oxygen to survive. So the respiratory system is very important in creating that oxygen so it is available for the body. So this first bullet point is actually a quiz question. Make sure you understand that. Death will result if oxygen is cut off to your body as quick as about 4 to 6 minutes. So it's really important that your body gets oxygen constantly. Yeah, really important. Oxygen from the air is converted, breathed in and then given to your body through the respiratory system. That's its whole job. So here's just a quick illustration of the respiratory system and the different structures. Again, we talked a little bit about the lungs. They are the most important portion of your respiratory system. Yeah. So this is also a quiz question. Make sure you understand this. There's two parts to breathing. There's respiration and ventilation. So respiration is the actual passage of air into and out of the lungs. And the two parts of respiration are inhalation and exhalation. So inhalation is breathing in, exhalation is breathing out. Whereas ventilation is the mechanical process that increases and decreases the size of your chest cavity. So ventilation plays a role in breathing because when you increase the size of your chest cavity, pressure is going to pull air into your lungs. Whereas decreasing the size of your chest cavity is going to force the pressure is going to push the air out. So that is more of the mechanical process, whereas respiration is the actual air passing into and out of. So make sure you understand those. So the biggest difference between adults and children, infants and children have smaller respiratory structures and very easily obstructed airways. Tongues take up more space in your mouth, and their trachea is more flexible. That is why, and this is very, very important, we'll talk about this a lot this semester. Make sure you put a star by it. It's a quiz question. The primary cause of cardiac arrest in children is an uncorrected respiratory problem in infants and children. So cardiac arrest, I believe we talked about it a little bit. Cardiac arrest is your heart actually stopping, can be caused by a few different things. In adults, cardiac arrest can happen from a heart attack, can happen from some sort of stimulation problem to the heart, so it's not beating. An arrhythmia can be caused by a lot of different things, but for kids, those types of problems are not common. They're very rare. So if your heart is unable to get oxygen through breathing, your heart tissue starts to die. And so that is why for children, most of the time when they have cardiac arrest or their heart stops, it's because they are choking. They have some sort of a respiratory issue. And so that really plays into the way we do CPR and life-saving measures for children. We'll talk about that some more in Chapter 5. But make sure you understand that that is a quiz question. Talking a little bit more about the respiratory system, one of the things that you need to be aware of are respiratory rates. This is the one of the measurements that we use to evaluate somebody's respiratory system and whether it's functioning properly. Your respiratory rate, so when we talk about these respiratory rates, you need to understand that we're talking about them at rest, meaning somebody is sitting, doing nothing, okay? Not doing anything that would raise their heart rate or cause any sort of distress, okay? During exercise, this is going to increase. During stress, this is going to increase, okay? So this is a quiz question. Make sure you understand these numbers, okay? For adults, your respiratory rate is between 12 and 20 breaths per minute. Adolescents is between 12 and 16. School-age children, 18 and 30. Preschoolers, toddlers, infants, 22 to 34, 30 to 60. As you'll notice, in younger populations, the respiratory rate increases. It is very normal for kids to have a very high respiratory rate, even at rest. So make sure you understand that. That will help you as a first aid provider, especially when you're treating younger people. Some other signs of inadequate breathing. So first of all, if their breathing rate is outside those normal ranges, that's abnormal, something that we need to look at. Other things to look for: cool or clammy skin that is pale or cyanotic. So the word cyanotic means blue. Okay, cyan is a shade of blue, and in medical terminology, that means that it is turning blue. So if somebody's skin is turning blue, that means they're not getting oxygen to their tissues, and that is a concern. That's a sign that their respiratory system is not functioning properly. Nasal flaring is where your nasal passages, I mean, you guys have probably seen that when your nasal passages get bigger. That is a sign that somebody is having to work harder to breathe, as well as very heavy chest rise. Um, and sometimes there can be a little bit of sucking in just at the base of your neck, right above your collarbone. Those are all signs that somebody is having to work harder to breathe. Okay, when talking about the cardiovascular system is made up of three groups of structures. You have your blood, you have your heart, and then you have your blood vessels. Okay, just a quick illustration here of the cardiovascular system. So the most important structure in your cardiovascular system is the heart. Your heart is the main driving force for this system and what allows it to work. Your heart is a pump that pumps blood through all of your blood vessels throughout your body. The heart is about the size of the person's clenched fist, shaped kind of like a pear. I don't know if I see maybe an upside down pear like that, but I don't know if I love that description. But anyway, it is located in the center of the left side of your chest. Okay, underneath your rib cage, where it's well protected. Okay, so your heart is divided into four chambers. Okay, you have two chambers or compartments where, like it's described here. You have your two atria, which are the top ones. So you have your right atrium and your left atrium. Then you have your two ventricles, which are the bigger chambers on the bottom, your right ventricle and your left ventricle. Okay. And this is what blood passes through when it's pumped throughout your body. Gets pumped back into your right atrium through from your body, where the whole process starts over again. All right. Perfect. So during the relaxation phase, that's when your atria receive blood. That's when those chambers start to fill. Okay. Your right atrium is receiving blood from the body. Your left atrium is receiving blood from the lungs. Okay. And then during the relaxation phase, before you get a full contraction, blood then, after entering the atria, flows into the ventricles, and then your heart contracts, pushing the blood out to either your lungs if it's coming from your right ventricle, or your heart, or to your whole body if it's coming from the left ventricle. Okay, I hope that all makes sense. If it's a better visual, you can refer back to slide number 15, where it shows all that stuff, right? Okay, so after blood leaves your heart, it goes into your arteries. Okay, arteries, we have a few different types of blood vessels. We have arteries, we have veins, and we have capillaries. The first type is arteries. Arteries are large blood vessels that take blood away from your heart. So that's how you remember what arteries do. They start with an A, so the blood goes away from your heart. Okay. Most arteries are going to be carrying oxygen-rich blood, meaning that it has received oxygen from the lungs and is being sent to the whole body. There's only one exception to that. Your pulmonary artery carries unoxygenated blood to your lungs, right? Your pulmonary artery, so if we're drawing this again really quickly, wow, that looks like a potato. That's awesome. Okay, so your right ventricle, right? We know that the blood goes from the right ventricle to the lungs. Okay, we'll just do LU for lungs today. This blood vessel that leaves your right ventricle is your pulmonary artery. Pul artery. I'm a very visual person, so it helps me to kind of see it a little bit. Okay. So that is the only artery in your body that carries unoxygenated blood. All right. Now, the other major artery for the lungs that carries blood away from the heart comes from your left ventricle, and it's called your aorta. It's basically a big tube coming out of that left ventricle that sends blood to your whole body. Okay. Wow, this is rough. Okay. So this would be your aorta. All right. Now, a couple of things you should know about arteries. They're large, they're elastic, but they also have musculature, meaning that they actually have muscles in them that contract to help push the blood along, so that you have to have high amounts of pressure in these blood vessels to get blood to your entire body. You have miles and miles and miles of blood vessels within your body, so blood has to go a long ways. Okay, and so it requires a lot of pressure to do that. As a result of that, when it comes to us as first aid providers, when we look at bleeding, arterial bleeding is different than what you might normally think of. It's pretty uncommon for arteries to get cut because they're usually pretty deep in the body. They're not really on the surface like capillaries or veins, which we'll talk about. But bleeding that comes from arteries has pressure on it. So that means that it spurts. It comes out when you bleed from an artery, it like squirts out at the rate of your heart rate. Okay. The other thing you need to know is that blood that comes from arteries is bright red because it has oxygen in it. Okay, and then we'll talk about the type of blood that you'll see coming from the other blood vessels as well. Our next type of blood vessel is capillaries. Capillaries are very, very small. This is where the exchange of oxygen between your blood vessels and your cells happens. And that happens at a very microscopic level, which means your capillaries are tiny. Okay. They also, when there is oxygen exchange at your capillaries, your cells will also exchange things like waste that need to be discharged from your body. Those things get excreted through urine and stuff like that. And also, your blood at your capillaries will also receive carbon dioxide to send back to your lungs for you to breathe it out. Okay. Anytime a capillary gets cut, it oozes. It does not come out fast. It's kind of a mix between a red and more of a bluish purple color. But like a finger stick is an example of a capillary cut, right? It comes out pretty slow. Most of the time you have to push on it a little bit to get a lot of blood to come out. That's what capillary bleeding looks like. The last type of blood vessel is a vein. Veins carry blood back to the heart from your body, okay? Veins, so they start small coming from the capillaries, and then they get larger and larger as they head back towards your heart. The major vein that enters the right atrium, just for your information, not that you 100% need to know this, but it's called the superior vena cava. That is what carries blood back into the heart. Okay. The other major vein that you should probably be familiar with is called the pulmonary vein. That is the only vein that carries oxygenated blood because it carries blood back from the lungs to the heart. Okay, so With veins and with arteries, the rule is always the same. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood back to the heart. For the rule that is most of the time is that arteries carry oxygenated blood and veins carry unoxygenated blood, with those two exceptions. The pulmonary vein carries oxygenated blood back to the heart, whereas the pulmonary artery carries unoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. Okay? As far as bleeding goes, so veins are usually what they draw blood from when you have to get blood tests done or when you're donating blood or plasma, which means veins are closer to the surface for the most part. Blood that comes from your veins is darker. It's like almost a purple, like a dark blue. That's because there's no oxygen in it. And blood from your veins, it will flow faster than capillary bleeding does, but it's still not like spurting like an artery. There's not near as much pressure. Okay. Something else we're going to talk about quite a bit throughout the semester that kind of helps us as first aid providers. Veins are very unstructured. So I like to think of it like this. You have like two types of hats, right? You have your flat brim hats that have a high crown in the front that are like hard, that don't collapse, right? And then you have your newer style like dad hats that are very, very unstructured. There's nothing to it. If you took it off your head, it basically is like a flat piece of material, right, with a brim. Okay. Veins are like the dad hats that have no structure to them. Okay. If there was no blood in them and you put any pressure on them at all, they're basically going to flat. Okay. So, that being said, with veins, in order to get blood back to your heart, a few things need to happen. It is done by leftover pressure from your atria. Okay. It is helped by muscles. When your muscles contract, it kind of milks the blood through those veins to push it back to your heart, as well as gravity. Gravity will help push blood from your veins back to your heart. That also being said, gravity can also be a hindrance to blood flow back to your heart. That's why if you have like bruising and things like that, all bruising is bleeding inside your body. If you have a vein that bursts and causes a bruise, the blood tends to flow with gravity. So that's why people that have like a really, really bad sprained ankle, sometimes the bleeding isn't right by where the sprain is at. So it can even go down into your toes and things like that because gravity pushes the blood down. Okay. So we'll talk about using gravity to our advantage as first aid providers. All right. Here's just a quick illustration of what that looks like. So an artery, right, carrying oxygenated blood through these big muscular vessels to your capillaries, this little fine network right by the cells where oxygen and nutrient and waste and carbon dioxide exchange happens, then flows to these bluer, not nearly as big veins that are not elastic, right? They're very collapsible to take blood back to your heart. Okay. So now talking about pulse. So you've probably all heard of a pulse, like finding somebody's pulse. They'll feel for your pulse when they're trying to find your heart rate. All a pulse is a surge of blood that goes through an artery every single time your heart contracts. Okay, and like we talked about, arteries are pretty deep in your body, so you have to find them in specific places. There's only specific places on your body where arteries come close to the surface so that you can feel them. Okay, so for example, when we look at these different locations, these are locations where arteries are close to the surface. You have your carotid artery, which is up in your neck. Okay, to find your carotid artery, if you go just to you feel on the side of your neck, there's a big old muscle right underneath your ear. okay? And then if you start to bring your fingers forward, which, quick note, when you are looking for pulses, you want to use your index and your middle fingers. Don't use your thumb, okay? There is an artery in your thumb that's very easy to feel, and so if you're trying to feel for somebody else's pulse, you'll probably feel your own. So you want to use your index and middle finger. So directly below our ear, there's a big muscle. If you start to roll forward towards your mouth, on your neck, just below your jawbone, there's like a big gap, and then you can feel your windpipe right in the middle of your neck. So in that gap, if you'll feel right there, put a little bit of pressure on there, you'll feel your carotid artery and you'll feel a pulse. Okay? Finding the femoral artery, we're not going to find the femoral artery because it's in a very precarious place. It's in your groin, just medial to your hip bones. But we're not going to look for that because it's in a very precarious place. The next one is your radial artery. Your radial artery is a very common one. It's on your wrist, just below your thumb. If you go just below your thumb, like the base of your thumb and your wrist, you'll feel, you'll follow the bone in your thumb down, and then you'll feel kind of a bone right there on your wrist that points outwards. If you roll towards the center of your wrist, to the medial side of your wrist, you'll roll off that bone, and then you'll feel a tendon just next to it. You go between that tendon and your bone, and you can feel your radial pulse. Okay. Your brachial pulse is in your elbow, just at the base of your bicep. To find that one, this one's the toughest to find. Okay. So this one, if you feel in the center of your elbow, okay, you'll feel a big old tendon, almost like a cord, right in the corner of your elbow. Okay, if you roll off of that towards your thumb, you should be able to feel it in there. Now, the problem with the brachial artery is for everybody, it seems to be a little bit different. I may put together a video kind of showing you guys where these pulses are at for your pulse assignment, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a second. Your posterior tibial artery is right at the back of towards your heel on your ankle, and your dorsalis pedis artery is on the top of your foot. So for your pulse assignment, what you're going to do is you're going to take 5 buddies, okay, and you're going to find their carotid, their brachial, and their radial pulse, okay? In here, I mean, this is pretty self-explanatory, but here you'll write their name. So we'll write Joe's name right here. I went and I found his carotid pulse, and I counted it for 30 seconds. Okay, so I have a watch up. I'm looking at the clock, and I'm counting while the second hand is going. And once it's got to 30 seconds, the number that I have gotten, okay, is how many beats per 30 seconds that he has. Now, this is going to be measured in beats per minute. So I can either hold that and count for the entire minute, or I can hold it for 30 seconds and times it by 2. So if he had 30 beats in those 30 seconds, then he would have 60 beats per minute. Okay? 60 BPM. Okay? I'm going to do the same thing for his brachial pulse. I'm going to do the same thing for his radial pulse. Now, this is really important. They need to sign. Okay? Whoever you take their pulse. So, the easiest way I have found for students to do this, okay, you have to have some sort of a signature. The easiest way to do it is to either make a table like this, write it down, print off something like this, fill this out, have your buddy sign it, right? Whatever, okay? And then take a picture of it and upload it to Canvas. Really, the only other good way to do it is to do it as a PDF and upload it through Adobe Acrobat, because there is a signature function. But that's a little complicated, kind of a pain in the butt. Writing it down, taking a picture of it, uploading the picture is the easiest way to do it. Okay, that is what your pulse time it is. You do that for 5 people, get 3 pulses on all 5 of them. They're carotid, they're not 3 carotids, not 3 brachials, not 3 radials. You have to find their carotid pulse, their brachial pulse, and their radial pulse one time. Then you write those numbers down, have them sign it, and you upload it when it's filled out. Okay? If you have any questions, please send me a message. I can try and help clarify. Okay? The next thing we're going to talk about blood pressures. So a blood pressure is a way to measure the pressure in your arteries. Okay? This is an indicator of heart health, of the health of your overall health, whether your arteries are completely open or maybe if you have something going on. Okay? So your blood pressure is measured like this. You have 2 numbers that have a specific meaning. So you guys have probably heard this, like, oh, your blood pressure is 115 over 60. Okay, something like that. These numbers mean specific things. So I guess I need to put a parenthesis there. I'll go and fix that later. So the top number is your systolic blood pressure, okay? Whereas the bottom number is your diastolic blood pressure, okay? So your systolic blood pressure is the higher pressure because it measures the pressure in your arteries while your heart is contracting, okay? Whereas the diastolic number, the lower number, is a measurement of the pressure in your blood vessels while your heart is relaxing, okay? And this is really important. This is a quiz question. Make sure you understand this, okay? The benchmark that we use as a normal blood pressure for adults is 120 over 80. So a systolic blood pressure of 120, a diastolic blood pressure of 80, okay? So there is a quiz question about this. You need to write 120 over 80. Lower than that, to a certain extent, is normal. Higher than that, we're starting to become borderline high blood pressure, but just around this number is normal for an adult at rest. Okay? All right. So the last portion of the cardiovascular system we're going to talk about today is your blood. Your blood is made up of some different structures, the solid portion of your blood being cells, and the liquid portion of your blood being plasma. Okay? So the solid portion of your blood is made up of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Your red blood cells carry oxygen. They're like little sailboats that carry oxygen to take it to the cells of your body. Your white blood cells are there for your immune system. They fight off infections. Platelets are used for forming clots to stop bleeding. And then to the liquid portion of your blood, your plasma is 90% of water. And then the other 10% of your plasma is made up of food materials and waste materials that are dissolved in the liquid portion. Okay? All right. So just as a quick activity for you guys to think about. As we talk about, now that we talked about the cardiovascular system, okay? So shock, we have a whole chapter about this. So don't worry about this too much. This is just for you guys to think about and to help consider why knowing anatomy is important as a first aid provider. Okay? So shock is a condition that is characterized by a lack of blood flow to the body. So blood flow is interrupted somehow and is not making it to the rest of your body. This could be caused by some different things, can be caused by bleeding, emotional distress, heart failure, and other things, okay? What I want you guys to think about is now that we know what shock is and what can be some different causes, what are some things that we can treat this condition? What can we do to help restore blood flow to the body, okay? What does blood provide for us? How do we combat poor circulation, okay? So, take a second to think about that. Pause the video for a second, think about it. All right. So, some things that we can do, for example, would be we talked a lot about gravity helping blood return to the heart. So in order to have oxygen with blood with oxygen in it, you have to have blood get back to your heart. If all your blood is sitting in your extremities and your arms and your legs and it's not making it back to the heart, it can't then receive oxygen and then be pumped out to the rest of your body. So we can use gravity to our advantage, right? So your legs are important, but they're not as important as your brain, as your vital organs in your trunk, things like that, okay? So if we elevate our legs to let gravity push some of that blood back towards the heart, then it can be used to, again, push oxygen out to those important structures. Okay, that's one thing. Another thing that blood does for us is it actually helps regulate body temperature. So, when we're not getting adequate blood flow to our body temperature tends to drop. So, one way we can help regulate that is by putting a blanket on somebody. Okay. If somebody's heart fails and their heart isn't pumping blood to their body, and that's what's causing the shock and the lack of oxygen to the body, that's when we do CPR to help push on the heart so that it can push blood out to structures. And we'll talk about that in chapter 5 some more. Just a quick activity just to show why knowing anatomy is important as a first aid provider. All right, so shock, also known as hypoperfusion, okay? We kind of talked about this a little bit, but these are just some quick symptoms of hypoperfusion. We actually have a whole chapter about this. So we're going to kind of skip over this. Okay, so the next body system we're going to talk about is the nervous system, okay? The nervous system is made up of a collection of nerve cells, and what they do is they coordinate all the parts of your body. So they send messages out to your body and tell your body to do certain things and tell structures in your body to do certain things, but they also receive feedback and send it back to the brain for processing and reaction to those things. Okay. The most basic nerve cell in your body is called a neuron. Basically, depending on what type of neuron it is and what structure it's a part of, it can do all of these things: receive stimuli, transmit impulses, produce impulses to be sent out, but neurons do not regenerate. Okay, nervous tissue is the most unpredictable and slowest regenerating and growing tissue there is. Okay. All right, so there are two classifications to your nervous system. You have your central nervous system and you have your peripheral nervous system. Your central nervous system is made up of your brain and your spinal cord, whereas your peripheral nervous system is made up of all of the nerves that branch off of, especially your spinal cord, and go out to your body. Okay? Your peripheral nervous system, it's kind of like blood vessels. Those nerves branch out to all parts of your body, and they're divided into two categories. You have voluntary and the autonomic, and or also known as the involuntary peripheral nervous systems. So the central nervous system is like the headquarters of your nervous system. It's basically your brain. There are three main subdivisions in your brain. You have your cerebrum, your cerebellum, and your brainstem. Yeah. So, the other part of your central nervous system, your brain, I was looking ahead a little bit. Your brain also has cerebrospinal fluid that flows somewhat through it, but around it to help protect the brain. But it also exchanges food and waste materials for your brain. So it's like, it works kind of like capillaries do. There are certain food and waste that gets exchanged between your cerebral spinal fluid as well. Your cerebral spinal fluid flows around your brain and also down through your spinal cord. Okay. So your spinal cord is this long column of nervous tissue. It is connected to the bottom part of your brain, runs through your spinal column, your vertebral column, and off of that spinal cord, you have 31 pairs of nerves that branch out to go to other parts of your body. Your spinal cord is a lot more vulnerable to injury than your brain is, mainly because although it is surrounded by all your vertebrae in your back, in order for you to be able to move your back and bend and things like that, between each of your vertebrae, you have joints that allow your back to bend. And since that can move, it is vulnerable to injury. Whereas your brain, right, your skull does not move. Your skull is one big bone that does not bend or it doesn't articulate with itself really anywhere. And so it is a much better protection for your brain than it is for your spine. All right, so here's where your spinal cord comes off of your brain. Your vertebrae kind of act like almost like ribs. They like encapsulate your spinal cord all the way down, right, to help protect that. And then these are just an illustration of the different nerves that come off of your spinal cord, and they run throughout your body. Like some of them go all the way down your arms. Some of them come out here into your back. These lower ones will run down your legs, those types of things. Okay. All right. So talking a little bit more about your peripheral nervous system. So once those nerves come off of the spinal cord, okay, they form a network that is responsible for two things. You have sensory nerves and motor nerves. Sensory nerves receive stimuli like the sensory nerves in your fingers sense when you touch something, or they sense temperature like, oh, this object's hot, oh, this object's cold. Motor nerves are responsible for telling your body to move and telling your muscles to work, okay? If a nerve is seriously damaged, that function of that nerve is compromised. So when you get damage to a sensory nerve, it is no longer able to sense that thing. So if a sensory nerve that is in charge of sensing pressure is damaged, you would no longer be able to feel pressure. Okay. If you have a sensory nerve that's in charge of sensing pain and damage, when it becomes damaged or blocked by some sort of medication, it is no longer able to sense pain in that area. Okay. Yeah. Most nerves are pretty well protected, mainly because they're deep. There are not many nerves that are very close to the surface within your body, so it typically requires a lot of damage to damage those nerves. Okay, so of the two large divisions of your peripheral nervous system, the first one is, so we talked about um, your peripheral nervous system as far as the voluntary actions of your peripheral nervous system. Now you have the autonomic peripheral nervous system, the nerves that go to your heart, um, the nerves that go to a lot of your organs. Those nerves are involuntary. You don't have to think to make your heart beat, right? When I want to bend my finger, I have to think about that to do it, right? But your heart just beats on its own. It's not something you have to think about. So those nerves that are in charge of those things are considered on an autonomic. Okay. All right. Now your skeletal system. As first aid providers, this is a pretty big one for us. The adult skeleton has about 206 bones. Bones are made up of living cells that are surrounded by hard deposits of calcium. So the marrow inside of your bones and the center of your bones is living cells, whereas the outer portions of your bone is no longer made up of living tissue. It was once a living tissue that hardened and died essentially, but formed the outside portion of your bone. Okay. So, talking about some important bones, the first one and most important is your skull. It's at the very top of your spinal column in your head. It houses your brain, some very important glands, and centers for your special senses. Your skull is made up of two parts. You have your cranium, or the part that encases your brain, and then you have your face. Okay. Um, Blood vessels and nerve trunks do go in and out of the brain through openings in that skull, but they can be fractured. You also have to understand that your skull does not give, so it is very rigid. If there is any give to that structure, there's likely been some damage. And we'll talk some more about that when we talk about head injuries. And the face portion of your skull extends from your eyebrows down to your chin. You can kind of see that on the picture. So this part would be your cranium, right? There's no joints there. It's all hardened. There's no give there. Whereas, and it's basically one big bone. Whereas from here, your eyebrows down makes up your face. There's a lot of little bones in there that make up your face. Okay. Talked a little bit about the spinal column. Your spinal column is made up of irregularly shaped bones that encapsulate your spinal column. Okay. So as you can see, they have like spines on the back, which is why it's called your spine. And then they have larger portions called your vertebral bodies in the front. These right here are little discs in between all of them that kind of compress to take on some of the stress of your body weight. But between each of these little bones, you have a joint so that your back can bend. Okay, you have 33 spinal bones. You have seven cervical vertebrae, which are in your neck, 12 thoracic, which are in your upper back, 5 lumbar vertebrae, which are in your lower back, 5 in your sacrum, which is the upper part right here of your butt, basically, and then you have your coccyx, which is your tailbone that has 4 parts. Okay, they're kind of bound together by ligaments and tissue and muscle that help hold them in place. But because they are made up of all these joints, they are very vulnerable to injury. So next, we're talking about your thorax. The bones in your thorax are your rib cage and your sternum together. They are there to protect your major organs. Any injuries to your thorax can be pretty devastating. If any of the bones, like any of your ribs or your sternum, break, those bones can actually damage the underlying tissues. So those tend to be a little more serious. All right, your pelvis is made up of 2 large hip bones, almost like dishes, and your sacrum, which is in the middle. So we talked a little bit about your sacrum with your spinal column. So it almost kind of looks like this. You have like a dish, and you have like, well, it's kind of like sideways, like a dish, and then you have your sacrum that looks like this. Okay, and then this kind of connects here. Wow, that is a terrible looking pelvis. But anyway, that's kind of what your pelvis looks like. The biggest thing about your pelvis is there is a ton of connections here for muscles, ligaments, tendons, those types of things that are in charge of the bulk of movement in your body. It also forms the bottom of your abdominal cavity, helps hold very important organs in place, and it helps protect some of those really important organs, especially reproductive organs. All right. So your leg bones, your upper leg is made up of your femur, down to your femur comes down and it connects to your lower leg bones, your tibia and your fibula. The joint where they're connected is your knee joint. Your patella is a little miniature bone right here on the front of your knee, also known as your kneecap. Your lower leg bones are your tibia and your fibula. So your tibia is the large bone in your leg. Your fibula is the outer leg bone that's smaller. Those form the lower portion of the knee joint. You have your ankles and your feet, so the bottom of your legs. Your ankle is made up of your tibia, your fibula, where they join your talus and your calcaneus here, your heel bone, and your actual ankle bone. And then you have some little bones down in your feet and in your toes. Okay. As far as your upper extremity, your arms, first you have your shoulder girdle, your collarbone and your scapula form your shoulder girdle. Clavicle fractures are very common. My daughter actually fractured her clavicle a couple weeks ago. It was really sad. She's 2 years old, so that was not a lot of fun. Just a quick illustration of that. So this is your scapula right here. You can't really see your clavicle here because we're looking from the back, but your clavicle comes off of here and then attaches to, in the front, this is where your sternum would be. Okay, your clavicle attaches to your sternum right here and helps hold your shoulder and to your sternum in place. There are a lot of really important arteries and structures that run underneath your collarbone that it helps protect as well. Okay, off of your scapula comes your upper arm. You have your humerus and your forearm bones, like your radius and your ulna. One really important thing you should note about your humerus, your shoulder, because it has a lot of motion, can be very easily dislocated. And we'll talk about that later in the semester when we get to extremity injuries, but that is something to be of note. Okay, down into your wrist, hand, and fingers. So once we get below the forearm, this is your radius and your ulna. Your radius is on your thumb side, whereas your ulna is on your pinky side of your forearm. Once it comes down to your wrist, it meets several little bones that help your wrist to be able to do a lot of motion. And then you get down into the small bones of your fingers. Okay. Yeah, you have 8 carpal bones that make up your wrist, 5 bones in your palms called your metacarpals, and then you have your phalanges. You have 14 of those that are the little bones in your fingers. Your thumb is the most important of all your fingers because of all the different things it does. Your foot really carries the same structure. They just have a little bit different names. They're called tarsals in your foot. So the long bones in your feet are called your metatarsals, whereas the phalanges, they're also called phalanges in your feet, are in your toes. Anyway, kind of interesting. All right. So joints, when we talk about joints, we're talking about anywhere where 2 or more bones meet or articulate or bend off of each other. Joints allow us to be able to move. Okay. Typically on the ends of those bones that make up a joint, there will be a layer of cartilage called articular cartilage. Ligaments help hold the bones in place. Ligaments are made up of bands of flexible connective tissue, but they are there to hold the structures there. Okay, ligaments do not contract and relax, whereas muscles and tendons do, which we're going to talk about next. There is also a thick fluid in between those bones called synovial fluid that helps protect the joint and allows those bones to glide past each other without causing damage. All right. So, when talking about the muscular system, you have 3 types of muscle. You have voluntary muscles, also known as skeletal muscle. Okay, like this. It kind of looks like this. It's in long striations, almost looks like fibers, all grouped together. Because muscular skeletal muscles are voluntary, meaning that you can move them, and they do move quite a bit. They're usually found in joints. They are very vulnerable to injury, okay, because as humans, we're not always the smartest cats out there, and sometimes we do things we shouldn't, and we can cause damage to them. Okay, the 2 types of muscle that are for the most part involuntary are called smooth muscles and cardiac muscle. Smooth muscles are found in tube-like structures in your body like organs or in like your digestive tract, your intestines, those types of things. They're involuntary for the most part because you don't think about digesting food. It just happens, and things like that. The only real voluntary smooth muscle that you have is in your sphincters, like down by your rectum and your anus, used for bowel movements. Cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. It is 100% involuntary. It is very strong, but it also needs, and because it's strong and gets used so readily, right? Like your heart never stops pumping while you're alive. It needs continuous oxygen and glucose to function. Okay. So the last organ we're going to talk about in chapter 3 is the skin. The skin is the largest organ in your body, um, and it protects your deeper tissues from being injured, drying out, or being invaded by bacteria. It also helps regulate body temperature. Your very outer layer, your epidermis, is very unique because the cells in your epidermis die very quickly, um, and are replenished very quickly as well. So they're constantly changing. Like every time you brush against your outer layer of skin, you lose millions of skin cells that you can't even see because they're so little. Um, but in order to maintain the integrity of your epidermis, those cells are replenished continuously. Okay. Here's just kind of an illustration of your skin. So the epidermis is the outer layer, whereas your dermis is those middle layers of your skin. In those layers, you have a lot of blood vessels and nerve endings. I talked a little bit about nerves that are in charge of sensing pressure and temperature. That's where the endings of those nerves are at, where they sense things. So right here it shows like some examples, right? They can sense pressure and temperature and those types of things. That's also where you find your sweat and your oil glands and your hair follicles are in that dermis layer. Okay. I know that was a ton of information. Okay. We are going to refer back to a lot of this stuff throughout the semester. So make sure you understand the basics. I went through the things that are quiz questions. I talked about the pulse assignment. Make sure that you get that done ASAP. Really not that difficult, but make sure if you have any questions about this information, I am new to the whole online teaching sector. Make sure you reach out to me, please. Okay. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.